Okay, I think we are live. So without further ado, we want to start off on our first panel discussion of the day. I don't think our speakers need much by way of introduction, because probably most of you know their names and their work very well, but also as a side note to say all of this, the full speaker bios are available on the WES website and will continue to be there throughout the conference. But just by way of brief introduction, this morning we will be hearing from Hans de Wit, who is Distinguished Fellow and former Director of Center for International Higher Education. And I would be remiss to say also the founder really of the WES-CIHE Summer Institute. So it's great to have you back, Hans, from your new location in Amsterdam. And we also have Elspeth Jones with us, who's Professor Emerita from Leeds Beckett University in the UK. I think Elspeth has also been with us for every single one of the summer institutes, maybe missed one along the way, but has been with us for nearly all of them. So we're thrilled to have Hans and Elspeth with us talking to us on the topic of internationalization as a global field. So without further ado, I will turn it over to you. Hans, are you starting off?
Yes, thank you. Good morning, afternoon, or evening, wherever you are. In this world that we are living in, this virtual world of internationalization of higher education. It's a great pleasure to be back at the WES-CIHE Summer Institute. First time not as an organizer, so that's a big relief, but happy to be a part of this and to see how many young scholars are actively from around the world in the field of internationalization of higher education. My brief remarks in 15 minutes will focus on indeed the internationalization as a global field of research and practice, because the two are very much related. Most of the people, at least in the past, who had been doing research on internationalization of higher education have been primarily practitioners who then became also scholars and were interested in studying what they were doing as international officers at universities or working for organizations like the American Council of Education or the International Association of Universities or whatever organization they were active in. And they started to do research to understand why they're doing it, what they were doing it, how they were doing it different than others were doing, and what might be the impact of that. So the field is in particular a scholar practitioner field. But increasingly there's a strong shift to see from originally it were mainly practitioners, and I'm talking about the late 80s, early 90s, when most of the studies on internationalization of higher education were basically descriptive case studies of institution strategies or national strategies. And that shift has gradually gone to be much more scholar practitioners. And now you see this whole field of people who are doing their PhD or have been just accomplishing their PhD or doing a master in international higher education. And so that gives more strength, but also as a repression, an indication of the importance of the field, which has been growing more and more as a specialized field within the broader field of education studies or higher education studies. So that's one important observation to make. And the second one I want to make is that related to that, you have seen a shift in terminology, where until the late 80s, early 90s, we spoke about international education. And that was a term quite commonly used and even has been manifested in the names of organizations like the European Association for International Education, in Europe, the Institute of International Education in the United States, even the Journal of Studies in International Education, the first academic journal in the field. That was a quite common term for, then around that first period when internationalization was still very marginal and ad hoc and not central to the core of higher education field. And only in the 90s, it shifted much more to use the term internationalization instead of international education, internationalization of higher education or of education. And that reflected a shift from being fragmented and activity focused to much more a process orientation. And the definition by my colleague Jay Knight always mentioned that it is a process of integrating an international, intercultural, and global dimension into the teaching and the learning and research of the institutions. So that process, you cannot talk about international education, but you have to move to internationalization of education. And that's now a much more common term. At the same time, being the former director of the Center for International Higher Education, you see also that we become much more aware that internationalization is not to be isolated on what is happening in higher education in the global context, what we call international higher education. So internationalization is very much now more related to the broader field of international higher education, which not studies only the process of how we are internationalizing at the national, at the global or institutional or program level, but place it in the context of what is happening in higher education around the world, doing comparative analysis, critical analysis, and also see what the contribution of higher education in the global context is in the knowledge society and in the process of massification. So there is a gradual transition going on from international education as being fragmented and activity-oriented to internationalization as a separate process, to integrating the international dimension into the higher education system. So that's another important factor to keep in mind. The third one is that internationalization for quite a long time over the past 30, 40 years has been mainly a Western paradigm. A Western paradigm of the English-speaking world and the developed high-income countries world in Europe and Australia and New Zealand, etc., where they were internationalizing higher education, and the low and mid-income countries, the global South, as we say it, was basically a reaction to those developments, stimulated and driven by and dominated by the whole Western paradigm it is, where now we can see also a shift there, that internationalization has become much more a global phenomenon, what Elizabeth Jones and I have been calling the globalization of internationalization. Now we see that in Latin America, in Africa, in Asia, in the Middle East, etc., also there's an own movement of internationalization taking place. And I'm pretty sure that Elizabeth will talk more about it, but it's important to see that phenomenon rising. On the one hand, trying to copy what the Western countries have been doing, but it's also, and increasingly that I see now as a result also of the pandemic, developing their own way of internationalizing, connecting it, for instance, with indigenization, criticizing, as Albert we were talking about, the colonial dimension of higher education, etc. So that's a third trend that we have to see. The fourth one is that internationalization was very much, until recently, mobility focused. Mobility in a very broad sense, because there are many types of mobility, but the two main ones, if we talk about student, is mobility for full degree programs and mobility as part of your home degree, so a semester abroad or a summer abroad, etc. Those were the main dominant factors of internationalization, and a little bit also the movement, the mobility of the academic staff, the mobility later on of programs and institutions, the whole transnational education development. But that was what was driving the agenda of internationalization, until we became aware, and that started already around the change of the century, and for instance in Europe with the internationalization at home movement, again something that Elspeth will talk more about. It became clear that if we focus internationalization only on the mobility side, it will be very exclusive, it will be elitist, it will not be increasing the equity and the diversity that we need in internationalization, because only a very small percentage of the student body, a very small percentage of the faculty will be involved in the mobility-driven internationalization process. On the global scale, 1 to 2%. Might be more in the United States, something like 9 to 10%, might be even more in Europe, something like 20%. But overall, it has been very exclusive in its focus. And so what we saw as a reaction to that, and still is in development, because those things unfortunately don't go as quick as we needed, we see now a shift from mobility focused to internationalization at home focused. with the risk that they are seen as two different components, where it has to be an integral process of bringing in the international dimensions into what we are doing. And so the more recent trend now is that we talk about internationalization as being global learning for all students, for all faculty, for all administrators, that we have to move away from this focus on only a small part of the people, but having to say, well, internationalization has to be for all. And in that sense, it aligns also with what John Hudzik has been calling internationalization as comprehensive internationalization. It has to be in all parts of what the higher education sector is. You cannot put it in the international office and say, then we have internationalized. No, it has to be in human resources, it has to be in finance, it has to be in student affairs and research, it has to be in all schools and all departments, etc. So that is another big trend that we have been seeing in development of internationalization as a global field. So that's, in my view, some key aspects. The other one is that it is internationalization is not one model that fits all, but always has to be seen in the context of different parts of the world, in different countries, in different regions, but also in different types of institutions, by different stakeholders, etc. So context analysis has become much more important in the internationalization field. Of course, we have to see what are global trends, and some of them I have just mentioned, but at the same time, we have to identify much more that each context relates to a different agenda. So how are we going to internationalize, and what will be the impact of the internationalization process? That is very important. And that's why it's so good to see how many different contexts are presented also among you as young scholars in the field of internationalization of higher education, that we know from what is happening in Latin America, what is happening in Africa, what is happening in Asia and Europe and in North America, and how that impacts both the higher education sector and its international dimension. So context analysis and context comparison is an important feature to do. And in that, again, we have to focus also on the countries that are not the dominant ones. So still, unfortunately, much of the research that is done on internationalization is on Europe, is on Australia, is on New Zealand, is on Canada, is on the United States. But we need much more to understand what is happening in the non-English speaking world and in the low and mid-income countries, and how can we develop there some new dimensions to internationalization. That they are not only copying, but that they are really focusing on their own international process, that their own identities, and react to the dominance of the Western world. So that, I think, are some key dimensions. That's why, as just one example to finish off, the Center for International Higher Education, myself as a lead researcher, but working with one of our graduate assistants, Joe Wang, working together with the Higher School of Economics in Moscow to do a study about what does it mean for non-English speaking countries to recruit, for instance, international students. Should they just do the same? Should they just automatically go to teaching in English to make it possible? And what are the risks of that? Should you just copy what the Western world do, or should they identify their own strategy to attract international students? And should that be much more focused on forgiving the mistakes that many institutions in the developed world have been doing by just going into it for the money only, by not looking at the quality, but much more at the quantity? Should they develop their own strategies for international student recruitment? And this kind of research, looking outside of the box of the traditional way of internationalization, in my view, is very important to make the global field of internationalization research much more sustainable and much more transformative at the same time. With those observations, I'm happy to transfer to Elspeth Jones for the second part of our discussion, and then we look forward to having a Q&A actively with the audience. Thank you very much, Elspeth. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Hans, and always stimulating as ever. I will be following up with some of those points that you've made, and hopefully people will feel it's opportune to ask some questions to both of us at the end of this this session. I do have some slides here which I'd like to put up here. I'll put it onto screen share. Right, so I want to talk about inclusivity in relation to curriculum and how we think about culture in that context, because we're constantly talking about intercultural as well as international, and really I want to focus on what that in fact means. So we have, oh, I've just lost my cursor, excuse me a second. Oh dear, my cursor's playing up here. So the question for us really is to think about, to begin with, okay, that's not mine. I think somebody else is screen sharing there. But if we think about internationalization as having two rationales here, one being pragmatically based and the other being more values based. The pragmatic side of it is thinking about employability and those graduates being able to perform differently as a result of internationalization. But I think the values-based rationale is very interesting. It's the one we tend to think about a little bit more often. It's about attitudes and how we apply our knowledge and abilities. So thinking about notions of global citizenship and responsibility, global issues such as through the Sustainable Development Goals and so on, and ethics and social justice. So these are the things which I'm going to focus on a little bit more today, although there are plenty of other opportunities to speak about others. I'm focusing here on a model for competencies required for democratic culture and intercultural dialogue. This is, it's been quite an interesting development of over many years by the Council of Europe, looking at the kinds of competencies that are needed to be good members of society effectively. The values, attitudes, skills, and knowledge, and so on, which we need to be able to live and work together. And this is so much in parallel with what we talk about in terms of internationalization, that I think it's a really important piece of work. And if you're interested, there's a lot of information about it. They've produced 3 additional volumes as well as explaining this, this model. But I think it reminds us that international and intercultural are really closely bound together. However, as Hans has said, there is a concern about whose voices are heard in internationalization, whose language is used, who designs the curriculum and what's the starting point of that, and who gets to study abroad. So I'll be looking at some of these in a bit more detail. In terms of who gets to study abroad, the answer is it's a very elitist activity, as Hans has already mentioned. And I think globally, there's an estimate of between 2 and 3% of students around the world who actually get to study in a different country. So it's a very, very small elitist activity. And yet many people think of, as soon as they think of internationalization, they think study abroad. So what we're trying to look at here is a bit more inclusivity and think more globally around what we mean. Now, Marginson, in his very interesting book in 2016, was talking specifically about these elite international activities which create rather than correct social inequality. He was talking about internationalization and the public good. And he said that even service learning activities, which are internationally focused, and are very rarely designed to make sure that both sides are benefiting, both the community being served and the visiting student and their home university. So there's inequality in a whole series of actions that we undertake in the name of internationalization. And this map reminds us again of the imbalance of what's happening. So these countries in red are those where English is spoken natively by the majority of the population, not everybody. But it reminds us also that we do expect people to write in English we assume that English is the international language, therefore the interesting things that are happening are written in English. And if people don't understand other languages, then those are the studies that they're restricted to. That is beginning to change, and we'll look at that in a few minutes. But for the moment, the dominance of English, the sort of hegemony of English, and therefore the Anglo and Eurocentric dimensions of this make it very, very important to address some key questions. Hans mentioned internationalization at home, which I like to think of internationalization of the curriculum at home, really, because it incorporates both dimensions of being at home and of dealing with the curriculum. But it's a problematic term because who is at home and what does that really mean? However, I say this having been a joint author of the definition of internationalization at home, and it talks about integrating international and intercultural dimensions into both the formal, the assessed, and the informal, unassessed curriculum. But importantly, it's for all students. It's not simply those who are able to travel and study abroad. And in order to really address this, we need to look at what we mean by culture, because we assume we know what culture means. And there's a 1963 definition here, which is quite interesting. The learned and shared behavior of a community of interacting human beings. Now, that suggests that it's much, much broader than what we typically think of, which is nationality and ethnicity and race and those kinds of questions around culture. So I think we should just address this for a second, thinking about some work by Adrian Holiday, and he talks about small cultures. He says we need to distinguish between two paradigms: that large culture, the default notion, where we think about ethnic, national, and international entities, and he says it's vulnerable to a culturist reduction of the idea of foreign students and essentializing the nature of those that foreignness. And he talks instead about a small culture paradigm, where it links to small social groupings or activities wherever there is cohesive behavior. And this can avoid us having this essentialist, ethnic, national, or international stereotyping. So if you have a particular interest group, anybody who shares your interests, you will have a relationship with them, which is essentially a small culture. So I, for example, am a member of a small group of people who are very interested in Star Trek, The Next Generation. So we can talk about that later, anybody who's interested. But the idea that small culture attaches to a different range of groupings than those that we think of as being primarily around nationality and ethnicity. If we take this one step further in thinking about cultural diversity in the curriculum and internationalization at home in particular, we've got a range of things which essentially we're born with: our age, our backgrounds, maybe religion, language, ethnicity, sexual orientation, gender identification, and whether we're fully able-bodied or disabled in any way. And we also then have a range of different types of students who may be mature, first in family, they may have caring responsibilities, people from indigenous communities, those who come from rural areas to study in a city, and so on. So the classroom, when we can actually get back into the classroom, is a very, very diverse classroom. And relating this to those concepts, some of those concepts that I covered, that I mentioned earlier, we need to think about how all of this ties in, this inclusivity ties in with those kinds of related concepts in order for us to be able to use these dimensions as part of teaching in the curriculum and working with cultural diversity, culture in that broadest sense, the small cultures notion by Adrian Holiday. So using the diversity as a resource. And I've written that transformative internationalization is not simply through international experiences, but constructive engagement with perceived, cultural otherness of any kind. So if your small culture and somebody else's small culture is different, there is the potential for learning between those two where those intersections are. And I've talked about the idea of interculturalization as opposed to internationalization as being one of the opportunities. And indeed, I've used this in my my work when I was at university, using wider community groups, looking at businesses, looking at other kinds of organization, and creating opportunities for students to either volunteer or take part in, through their curriculum opportunities, these different dimensions of wider society, wider community. And I've written about this in various places, and of course I'll be very happy to answer any questions that you have. But just sticking with the idea of interculturalization, we need to create the potential for students to question any assumptions that they've had in their minds, that they've been brought up with, thinking about the alternative viewpoints and crossing what may be very small cultural boundaries to extend their knowledge and understanding, thinking about diversity as an essential way of living in order to live and learn in our changing societies. So we must think much more broadly when we think about culture. We must think much more broadly when we think about inclusion as part of developing the curriculum. Now, as part of this, you've probably heard of the term decolonizing the curriculum, the questioning of the values underpinning internationalization. And Selby talked in 2008 about doubting the superiority of our own cultural values. Now, you'll see a few references coming up to Sharon Stein's work, and I know she's speaking tomorrow, so I'm sure she'll be talking on all of this much more eloquently than I can, but I just wanted to raise a few points ahead of that. Until we see those of us who are in the West, those of us who are in a Eurocentric and Anglocentric mindset, we need to question our values. We need to question the way we approach internationalization and be much more mindful that it's approached in different ways in different parts of the world, and the starting points are different, and the colonialization that we have allowed to be assumed as underpinning internationalization in many respects needs to be addressed, needs to be taken into account. And the privileging of Western, those largely white perspectives, I think, again, Sharon will talk about this, she and others argue they risk perpetuating the power relations and normalizing inequalities, minimizing the contribution of diverse voices and indigenous knowledge. And these are the things which I think we're beginning to recognize much more and are being developed through different aspects of the writing that you can now read, the literature base for internationalization. I've got references to all of these, by the way, the bibliography at the end. And so we must address these questions of ourselves, those of us who are from this largely white, largely Western, largely English-speaking community that writes about internationalization. So these approaches have been called into question as being uncritically dominated by Anglo and Eurocentric worldviews. As Hans mentioned, we've written about it on a number of occasions, both in the article mentioned there, but also in our book, The Globalization of Internationalization, that we've written with Jocelyn Gasalavila and Nico Joosten. Hans talked about the idea of academic colonialism back in 2002, and Mestenhauser warned of academic ethnocentrism also in 2002, the role played by our own personal cultures in acquiring new knowledge. So this has been around for some time, but to be honest, the addressing of it has been only really taking off in the past, I don't know, 4, 5, 6 years, where it's become quite seriously part of the literature and what we've been talking about. And very importantly, these questions have been raised in relation to international education associations. So there's a very, very interesting article by Buckner and Stein there, looking at the way even international education associations write about their purpose, and the documents they produce has got a very specific perspective. So that's an interesting article to read. The way we describe the graduate attributes, Bullen and Flavelle are talking about what the graduate attributes written in Australia, now how they tend to be very dominated by a certain type of view of culture. Sharon Stein again on internationalization of curriculum. The outcomes from study abroad by Leskin Green in an interesting chapter last year. And then the way we encourage students to engage with otherness, the way we describe otherness when we're encouraging students to engage is also being addressed much more seriously. So nearing the end here, Buckner and Stein in that same article suggest that internationalization should be understood as an approach to encountering difference, which opens up possibilities for examining and re-examining the biases, stereotypes, and the hegemonic assumptions we have about ways of being and knowing. And again, it is a very interesting article. I would encourage you to read that. As Hans mentioned, we are beginning to hear different voices in terms of books that are being produced. So there's a couple of books here. The first one, which was published just earlier this year, looking at internationalization of higher education in the global South. And then the one that he mentioned just now that he's edited with some colleagues, which is looking at recruitment in non-Anglophone countries. So that's also very interesting. So I'm sorry it's a very quick canter around some of these very, very important issues, but I'd like to thank you for listening. And those are my contact details there. And of course, I'm happy to answer any questions that arise through the chat. And my reference list is here, which I will also make available. I'll make my presentation available so that you can follow up on those if you're interested. But thank you very much for listening.
Thank you so much, Hans and Elspeth. Provocative and enlightened all at the same time. We've got some questions coming through the chat. I know there may be some coming through on the live stream as well. I've tried to sort of group them. There's two questions that are a little bit related and that they're sort of definitional. And so I'm happy for either of you to take this. Maybe Hans, you could start us off, but Elspeth, do come in as well if you have a comment. I'll ask them together because I do think they're somewhat related. So the first question is, can you comment on the relationship between global, international, and intercultural, specifically how they have and should be used in research and for what purposes? And the person who asked said, as a graduate student, I'm not confident that I'm always using these terms in my writing appropriately. So just saying something about those terms, how they're used and how they should be used in research. Related to that, there was a question specifically about Holliday's small culture definition. The question is, what's the difference between interculturalization and inclusion? So where is the international in those terms? So Hans, would you be willing to kick us off with those?
Yeah, and happy also to hear what Elspeth has to say about that. It's a very, the question about indeed internationalization of international, intercultural and global in the definition, which has always been there from the start by Jane Knight, although I think global was only added later, but still. It's an interesting question, and I can understand they're struggling with that. And even to the extent that many people see that as a kind of similar, where there is a difference in the sense that in general, seeing the globalization process was seen as what is happening in globalization in our societies and what that impacts on higher education. So it's more the global and trends, and they can both be positive and negative, because I mean there are certain aspects that you need to have as part of the globalization, but there are also very serious challenges to that. Where the intercultural is much more looking at the cultural dimension, and Elspeth has been referring a lot to that in her talk, where the international is between nations, and so has been much more the traditional way of how we look at internationalization as mobility from one place to the other, exchange between one country and another country. But it is sometimes a little bit confusing, and I would say, and I don't recall if I had this discussions with Elspeth, but with several other people, including my other close friend and colleague of us, Betty Lisk, should we maybe get rid of this whole word about internationalization? Because that's a very traditional way of looking at things between nations, where the process has become much more between cultures, looking into the local and the global and all those aspects. So we have to be careful about when we use certain words, but I don't think there's a solution to the problem, because internationalization, like international education, has gotten such a kind of understanding that it's difficult to get rid of it. But be careful when you use those words, what you mean with those words. That would be my main answer to the question. Be careful not to use them intertwined, but look into what are the difference. But for sure, it's true that the focus has been shifting, and that came very clear from Elspeth's talk, to much more the focus on culture than on nations, or on the global process. But that's my first response to that, and Elspeth can do that, and at the same time also respond to the second part of the second question.
Well, I think I've spoken to our colleague Betty Lisk about this, and she, because in her definition of internationalization of the curriculum, she talks about bringing in international and intercultural and global perspectives into the curriculum. And so I asked her what she actually meant by this. And I think she sees international as being between two countries, whereas global is relevant to the whole world. But I think I agree with Hans, it's increasingly difficult to explain these differences. I think the term globalization tends to be associated with business and trade and so on, rather than necessarily our particular field. So personally, I do think we have some problems with these using these words, but I wouldn't discount using it in research, but it is quite difficult to distinguish between global and international. I tend to use them interchangeably, actually. And the other question then was about, it was to do with Holliday's small culture, the difference between interculturalization and inclusion of special needs and so on. I think his point wasn't that we shouldn't include different national backgrounds, and there could be, there could be aspects of this. He's not saying to discount it. I think what he's saying really is to try to think differently about the way we use terms, because everybody uses the word intercultural as being, as though we all understand what it means. But in fact, most people use it to mean different nationalities or different ethnicities and so on. And culture is becoming so bound up with the idea of these, what he calls these large cultures, big cultures, that I think we just need to discriminate between them a little bit, to think more carefully about what we really mean when we talk about culture. And that's what I was trying to say in my talk, because the opportunity to, as Henry Giroux talks about border crossings, I'm not sure if you've ever read any of his work. In his work on critical pedagogy, he talks about crossing borders, and those borders really are equivalent in a way to those cultural boundaries which we can use to develop our ways of thinking more critically in the way we address difference or otherness, or think differently about otherness and difference. And so I wouldn't want you to imagine, I mean, Holliday's a great scholar, and he writes really interesting things around intercultural issues, and definitely worth reading. But it isn't that he dismisses international, it's just he thinks it should be much more nuanced than the way we describe it at the moment. So I hope that's answered the question.
Thank you so much to both of you. And I realized that in the spirit of interactivity, it'd be helpful if I said who was asking these questions. So those two questions came from Guanlong Pang, who's based here in the US, and Becky Bergman, who's based in Sweden. I say based in because I do not want to start to comment on where people's backgrounds are coming from in the spirit of Elspeth's talk. So thank you very much for that. I want to turn to another question from Marissa Lally. I know exactly where Marissa's from because she's a Boston College student. Hi, Marissa. So her question is, how do we address problems of racism and colonization stemming from domination of Eurocentric, Anglocentric worldviews when understandings of race and ethnicity are highly culturally specific around the world? And I actually just noticed another question that just came through just now from Xiaojie Kai, which is very similar, so I'll ask it again together. That question is, at the moment, decolonizing of curriculum and institutions have a very primary goal on race inequalities here in the US, especially after the BLM movement. And at times I feel international students and staff are very marginalized in the narratives of decolonizing initiatives, as there are more urgent issues domestically. That's how it's sometimes phrased. So how can we somewhat bridge the fields and start some conversations? I think those two questions go quite nicely together. Elspeth, would you be willing to kick us off on that one?
Yeah, well, it's really hard, and it goes back to the point that I made about this Selby question about doubting the superiority of our own cultural values and so on, that we need to address what's happening within ourselves to begin with, and where we're coming from and how we perceive what's going on. Now, it's really difficult in today's world when everybody seems to be facing, challenges on all of these fronts, and that there's increasing shift to the right in national politics. But on the other hand, these sort of positive moments where we've got the Black Lives Matters, we've got the Me Too movements, where issues are being raised, which we've kind of swept under the carpet for years and years. So it's good that society is beginning to pay attention to some of these things, but we must address it within ourselves before we can help students and others to address it for themselves as well. I was busy looking through those questions in the chat at the same time, Rebecca, so I'm not sure whether I've answered that particular question, but I think really it's looking at ourselves, helping students to look at themselves, and working across addressing questions towards the idea that we can look at culture in a different way, look at cultures and what everybody brings to the table, and respect the diversity in the broadest sense that we have. I was giving a talk in China last week, and people were saying, oh, well, all Chinese people are the same. And I said, well, clearly they're not. I mean, if we go back to that first set of questions, that the points that I made there, age, gender, sexuality, sexual orientation, those kinds of things are all differences which we can use to address some of these questions in themselves, without adding then in religion, ethnicity, and so on, as different aspects of diversity. So I hope I've answered the question, but if I haven't, please send me a message.
Thanks, Elspeth. Hans, do you have any comment on that one?
Well, yeah, first of all, I think that it's very important that these kind of issues about racism and colonialization have to become a key part of the input from those people that are involved in that. So from the developing countries, from students that are African American, Latin, etc. So they have to tell their stories. They have to pressure us. That's very important to do. And the other point, and that's I found the second question very interesting and very relevant of Xiaojie Kai. There is indeed in higher education still a divide between the study of multiculturalism and racism on the one hand, and internationalization on the other hand. They are two completely different entities in the higher education institutions. Different people deal with that, and there's no connection between the two. And what things like Black Lives Matters movement have made clear is they should be connected, because the international students are facing racism. They're facing the same kind of racism, maybe within a different, coming from a different context, as African Americans find in the United States. And still the universities in the United States, and I'm looking in particular at that case now, but I've seen the similar kind of developments in Europe. They treat much more the focus on racism and multiculturality in the national context, but not in the international context. And we have to do that. Otherwise, we are not going to solve the critical issues that are on the table. So it is important indeed to connect those two much more than we are currently doing.
Thank you. Yeah, and I think those two questions both sort of have an element of border crossing, if you will, right? So I mean, Marissa's question's a bit, I think, if I'm paraphrasing for her, I think her question is sort of thinking about the comparative aspects of this, how we think about these questions of racism and decolonization comparatively when they're so culturally specific to different contexts, to different groups. But then the other question is also a border crossing question within our own institutions, right? So how do we have the domestic work that is happening on university campuses around racism, marginalization, et cetera, speak to the International Student Office? So often they don't talk to each other whatsoever. So I think that's a practitioner question, but another important boundary crossing question that's being asked. And I will just say that Roger Anderson added another comment on this before we turn to a different comment. He says that the issue seems to be with the concept of small culture is that now we're no longer talking about internationalization. We're merely talking about teaching people to be decent human beings to each other. Does that not efface our work? What's the point of internationalization or people like us who do this work if that's where we're moving? Do you have any comment on that before we move to a different topic?
Well, I mean, as I said, it's not effacing the international dimension, because the international dimension is also a cultural difference. If we start, in a way, when you first meet somebody, if they say they come from the Czech Republic, you may have a set of concepts around that. As you get to know them better, you may find that they come from the bisexual community, that they work in, I don't know, in a motorbike repair shop. So there are aspects of big culture and small culture that we've all got within us. Everybody's made up of all of these different dimensions of small culture, and that notion of intersectionality is really, really important, because we have many different dimensions of these things within us. If you think about when we talk to each other as individuals, we start off with certain perceptions. We start off by the way somebody looks, or we make assumptions about them from the way they look. But as you gradually get to know them, you explore different dimensions of the small cultures within them, and they are opportunities for learning. And these are the ideas that we need to use in the classroom. And I think we dismiss that at our peril, really, because this is how we interact with people. And going back to the diagram that I showed, the intercultural dialogue model from the Council of Europe, that is exactly what they're looking at. How do we interact with other people across? In this case, it was based around the European model, but a very diverse view of a European model, which applies in other countries as well. So the idea being that we become better human beings, better at living and working with diversity within our environment, wherever we happen to be. So it is exactly that. It's exactly what it's about. Thanks,
Elspeth. I think we should move to some of the other questions, because there's some different aspects, I guess, that are coming through the chat. So this is an interesting one coming from Ilok Malay, who's based in the Netherlands, like you, Hans. And the question is about another sort of pragmatic rationale for internationalization, I guess. So the impacts of ranking systems on internationalization activities. So I guess this is a tension, right, with some of the more idealistic or values-driven definitions that you've been talking about this morning. So you put in the comment, we know that ranks are dominated by universities in English-speaking developed countries. International students keep being clustered in those universities because they want to go to those kinds of universities. That's where scholarships are provided to go to those higher ranked universities. And as a result, that means internationalization as an activity is funneling people into those kinds of places. At the same time, smaller universities are being forced to copy them. So at the end, competition within rankings has become part of the internationalization program and is having an impact. So Hans, would you like to speak on that question? How we might counter that more negative effect?
Yeah, we could have a whole session about that topic. It's a relevant topic, and at the same time it's complex. I mean, the reality is indeed that rankings and also the way they measure internationalization in those rankings, which is quantitative and limited, because it's only focused on the number of international students, the number of international scholars, and the number of co-publications with international authors. That's giving quite a wrong direction to the way institutions and governments should focus when they talk about internationalization, because it stimulates indeed the recruitment of international students and of scholars. It increases the competitive development, and in that automatically it means that those who are highly ranked have more opportunities to be more international and being much more effective than the rest of us. So this is a self-fulfilling prophecy. Basically, the rankings are developing. Can we change that? We cannot likely change the rankings. We can put criticism on them, and we do that, and we try to make them more acceptable for things. But in the end, I don't think it will have much of a difference. So, and since rankings are there, we have to be realizing that that's a fact. At the same time, what is more important, and Gerardo Blanco and Laura Rumley and I have been writing a chapter for a book that comes out about rankings, just on the internationalization role of in rankings. We say, well, you have to look at it differently. You should not let yourself in your internationalization strategy driven by the indicators of the rankings, but you have to look at your internationalization on why it's important for your institution, for your quality of what you are doing. And if that might result in that you increase in the rankings, that's fine. But that should not be the other way. And that's what we see now with a lot of governments doing and a lot of institutions doing, that they say, well, we have to become excellent. So what we have to do, we have to follow the ranking indicators also on internationalization, which also means, and that's another question about that, that we, for instance, have to teach in English, because otherwise we don't get enough international students and we don't go into the rankings. We have to have more international scholars who teach in English, because then we move up in the rankings. Result is, it doesn't really change the quality of what they are doing, because most of those international students are then separated from the local students. Most of the faculty that teach are foreign faculty and not the local faculty. And so you get even much more inequality and inequity in the whole system than before. So that's, it's not easy, but we have to base ourselves on, let's focus on our own criteria, our own purposes, and not let ourselves driven by the rankings.
Thanks, Hans. Unless you have a burning response on that one, Elspeth, I may move to another question.
It's not a response. I agree with Hans entirely. They are distorting our field. But I just wanted to add something which I think was towards the end of the question, which was that you don't need international students in order to have an internationalized curriculum. And I've tried to, talk to some degree about, how we use the intercultural rather than the international to have these conversations. So people assume you need a lot of international students to have an internationalized curriculum, and you don't.
Yeah, that's an important caveat that does often get sort of forgotten about in these policy conversations. I see there's a question from Yo-Yo Zhang, who's based in Canada, which I think brings some of these different topics together. So her question is about mobility, but it's also about how structural inequalities, which we've been talking about, affect mobility as well. So her question is, my research found students from more elite universities in China tend to have more international opportunities or resources, and that's at least partly due to systemic stratification in China. Mm-hmm. So she's assuming that's happening in other systems as well. So whether you could comment on how systemic inequalities like that affect the possibilities of more inclusive internationalization. Elspeth, would you be happy to take that one first?
Yeah, I'll start. There is. I mean, this affects all aspects of all our lives, doesn't it? I mean, we know that inequality is just embedded in across our our nations, the way our cultures work, the way our countries work, the way things are organized. There's this systemic inequality in all kinds of different ways. Now, in terms of study abroad, for example, there's been a lot of work done on the fact that with people who do study abroad, first of all, they've got to be relatively well off, but importantly, they tend to have various aspects of, Bourdieu's different cultural, the different dimensions of what Bourdieu talks about in terms of capitals, that they come to the table with more to begin with, partly because their family has brought them up in a certain way. And there's been a lot of research looking at study abroad in this sense. So that's just one aspect of the whole dimension of inequity. And in a way, it makes you despair to some extent, because you think, well, we've got to, in order to bring about equity across what we're trying to achieve, we've got to address some of these systemic issues in society, and it's very, very difficult. I think one of the ways to address it, first of all, is to be aware of it and to start addressing it where we can. But the idea of behind internationalization at home is to make sure that we try to bring those international and intercultural perspectives to all our students, not just those few who can afford to study abroad or who have the cultural capital to be able to take advantage of the opportunities. But yeah, I mean, I do get a little bit depressed when I think about some of these issues, I have to say.
Yeah, although on the other hand, the reality also is that many of those elite universities, and take for instance in the United States, the percentage of students that have an international experience is in many cases much more limited than in other types of institutions. And the reason is because those elite institutions think, well, we are international by nature. So if you come to us, we tell you how the world is working. And they don't get that international experience by seeing that the world is differently working in Latin America or Africa. So in that sense, other institutions who have not this kind of arrogant elite approach are forced much more to stimulate the students to get another experience. And that's also what might happen in Latin America and Africa, etc., where they say, well, we have not the possibility to have the resources to go abroad. And that's why we have to develop much more an internationalization at home policy, that we have to go into collaborative online international learning opportunities, because that's the way we can do it. And that's also giving them a comparative advantage. So, of course, inequity exists in between the top universities in the world, both in China and the UK and etc., in resources, etc. But at the same time, you can make that to an opportunity for the other ones to be doing much better than those.
Yeah, thanks for that. I know you brought up the point about language at some point, Hans, and Elspeth, you also mentioned both of you mentioned the recent project on language. There's a question from Carolina, who's based in Poland, on whether there's any possibility of abandoning English as a lingua franca. Clearly there's issues with it in terms of inequalities, but at the same time, that's a hard thing to shift, and it does provide some common ground. Is this even a productive conversation? Are we just where we are at with language, or is there other things we could be doing?
Well, I'm really hoping that there will be some kind of technical solution to this in the fullness of time, because Google Translate is really helpful for us. I don't know if you use Google Translate very much. As long as you can, get a sense of what's meant by it, it works really well. And I try and read things in different languages where I can, but I do sometimes need some help. I think the key to this is to have some kind of search tool, which will allow us not to simply read something that's put in front of us, but to be able to search for the kinds of articles that we want to read. So if the longer that we assume people need to write in English for it to be made visible, to be cited and so on, the longer this need for a lingua franca is going to continue. But I do believe that there are things being written in other languages. I've read some things in other languages which are interesting and helpful. The problem is at the moment it won't reach a wider audience, and more importantly, we can't search for it. But I'm really hoping that one of these days there's going to there will be a technical response to all of this, and I can't wait for the day. And then hopefully we won't have such a domination of English.
Yeah, that's I agree with that. I mean, English will continue to be the lingua franca for quite a while, because it's the dominance of the Western world and English-speaking world on the one hand, but also the fact that it is the second language for most people around the world. So in that sense, it beats both Spanish and Arab, and it beats Mandarin Chinese, and that will continue to be the case still for quite a while. But new technologies will help. Also, the globalization of internationalization might help if students are not automatically going anymore to English-speaking countries, but more diverse. Then it will be much more possible to create possibilities for bilingual programs, etc. But it's also indeed, again, the non-English speaking world, in particular in the emerging world, has to stop thinking that English is the solution to everything. So they have to say, well, we have to be proud about our own language and our culture, and we have to stimulate that as much as possible to do that. I think there is a related concern, which in my view is much more stronger, is that by the fact that English is not only dominant and there's a Western paradigm in higher education research in general, is that many of the scholars, in particular in the United States, but to some extent also in other English-speaking countries, have the tendency only to use local sources. So they only use American authors. They only use American case studies. They don't have a comparative perspective on what is happening in their field. And that, I think, is a much stronger bias that we have to tackle. That we have to say, you cannot write an article based on only one perspective. You have to bring in that. If you have a book, you have to bring in authors and resources from other parts of the world as well. And you have to be clear where you're focusing yourself. Many of the books written by American authors say that they are, for instance, the handbook on, I give one example, which I recently saw, the handbook on higher education research. And then if you look at the content, it only are American authors, and it only goes about higher education research in the United States. So at least a simple adding in the United States would already solve that problem a little bit, that you know it's narrow, etc. But they don't do that. So that arrogancy is even much more important in my view that we have to tackle than the language issue, which is basically a language of communication.
I think the other problem, though, it's not just about the communication in a sense, because if we don't acknowledge these sort of diverse perspectives, we're in danger also of ignoring local and indigenous knowledge paradigms. And as Hans said, we're very much focused on an Anglo-Western paradigm. So, having an opportunity to learn from different ways of thinking, different ways of doing, different ways of problem solving. The danger is if we focus entirely on English, we lose all of that, all of the complexity and opportunity that can be brought by different languages and different ways of thinking.
Absolutely. I think there's a translation of terms issue there as well, right? So, I mean, first of all, there's the US thinks the world stops with it. You just take one look at the World Series in baseball to understand that understanding. But it's also, I think sometimes I had this conversation with students on our program here that even if they are trying to find diverse perspectives to represent, a range of understandings about a topic in a paper, if they're only searching with a search term, which is what something is called here in the US, they still will only get the US articles because that is not a term that's used anywhere else. So it's also, even within the same language, it's about expanding the terminology that we use when we search as well.
And if they only search internationalization with a Z rather than an S.
Exactly. Spelling, terminology, all of those things. So we are within 10 minutes at the end. So I want to be sure we get to the final questions. There's one question in particular I want to be sure that we touch on, but I wanted to just mention the other two. I think if it's okay with you both, we'll just do one more visit to you both, tackle any of these that you would like. But the first one that I want to be sure that at least one of you responds to comes from Batul Sahin, who's coming to us from Turkey. She says, Professor DeWitt mentioned the benefits of increasing context-based research in non-English speaking countries. I am a researcher in one of those countries. I agree that there is a lot that is not applicable to my context that has been written. So since today we have researchers from some of these countries, I want to ask whether you might propose some topics that we can conduct. How do we make sure that our voices are added? So I think that's an important question just for the whole conference as in general. But also just, I want to be sure that people aren't left hanging. There was also a question from Kathy Huang in Hong Kong about the relationship between internationalization of the curriculum and international accreditation. If either of you would like to speak on that. And then there was a follow-up from Guanglong on the terminology question about where the trans prefix comes in. So when we're thinking about international versus transnational, intercultural, cross-cultural, is it just up to our own interpretation, or is that another thing that is somewhat defined in the field? Obviously, those three things are very different, so you can take just one or a couple, but if we could have one more round of comments. Hans, do you want to kick us off on that?
Well, the first question is, of course, a very broad one, and I will address it a little bit more in the final panel as well. In general terms, I would say, look at the local context. So what is important in your country or in your region, in your type of institutions, and take that as a starting point for doing research. And don't start with thinking, okay, they are all talking about recruitment of international students, so I should do my research on that. Or they're talking about another topic which is more popular in the Western world. So look at your own context and look, we haven't addressed it so much, but the local context is much more important than internationalization than the global context, because the local context is where you see the impact, where you see what you can contribute. So take that as a starting point of your research. That would be, my view, very important. On the topic of terminology, transnational, cross, etc., and how that relates to internationalization, in itself is a topic and which is relevant because we use those terms very easily. I can use a lot of terms so easily in our research, and every week we define a new term to make things happening. And all those labels, all of this terminology are so confusing because sometimes they are addressing one specific aspect or they just are doing something completely different. So take transnational education. Some people define transnational education as being compared to internationalization abroad. So all the mobility aspects. Others deal with it only for the cross-border delivery of higher education programs and institutions, or the branch campuses, the franchise operations, the twinning programs, and don't include the mobility. And there are others who use other terms to do that. Be precise on what you mean when you use those terms, but also try to avoid to get too easy in using terms that have no really meaning at all. That would be my advice on that. And on the last topic about accreditation and what is the difference, there's a complete difference between accreditation of programs and internationalization of the curriculum. And there should not be a difference in the sense that accreditation of curriculums, international accreditation of curriculum, should include also internationalization criteria, which they in general don't do. They also are a Western paradigm of accreditation. You have to be equal to an American program or a British program or a Dutch program or whatever, but they don't look at what is the international relevance of those programs, what is the local relevance of those programs. So that's different. It should be there should be much more internationalization of the curriculum in international accreditation, but it's certainly not the same in my view. But then Elspeth can disagree or add to that.
No, I agree entirely, Hans. As always, we always agree, don't we? But I put the Betty Lesk's 2009 definition in the chat box there of internationalization of the curriculum, and her book Internationalizing the Curriculum is kind of the Bible on that. Even though it's in my book series, I will say that it's really worth reading if that's the thing that you're interested in. But bringing at this an international dimension or intercultural, she's added global at a later stage. into the content of the curriculum, as well as the teaching and learning arrangements and the support services of a program of study. It's not about measuring whether it happens. And often those international accreditations, they're to do with, for example, getting a kite mark, like a business accreditation for your business program, or there are internationalization kite marks, as it were, that you can try to have your programs accredited. But it's a very, very different thing. And as Hans says, we should really be incorporating internationalization into curriculum across all different areas, whether or not it's assessed as such. So yeah, I mean, and the point about the cross, trans, and inter, I think we need to be very careful about how we use these things. But the problem is that the more we go on using definitions, the more somebody, as Hans says, feels the need to come in and define it differently or come up with a different term. So the most important thing to say is, whenever you're doing your research, whenever you're doing your writing, be absolutely clear on your understanding of the term. So if you say intercultural, what do you mean by culture? If you say transnational, what do you mean by transnational? And there are many different definitions of all of these things. So just be totally clear. There's no necessarily right and wrong, because things have moved on so much, but there we are. So, and I agree entirely with Hans about going back to the Turkish context. Yes, don't try to copy whatever research has been done elsewhere. Do something which is relevant to your local context. So thank you very much for all the great questions and for all the interaction. It's been a really interesting session.
Yeah, thank you so much to everybody. And I'll just say thanks also for those of you who are using the chat to make comments. I didn't read those ones aloud, I just asked the questions. But I will, sorry, Becky, I will post that link again. Please do keep doing that in future sessions. If you have a comment, or if you want to reflect on personal experiences, as people were doing in the chat this time, do feel free to do that. But we will close there.